And now I'd like for Becky to come forward to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Father Albert, and thank you for Father Andrew, Monsignor Connolly, and I know that many of you know our friend Jim Heft, without whom we would not be here. So, and thanks again, especially to Rich and Marie. I am delighted to introduce Austen Ivereigh. He is, as I'm sure many of you know, the Pope's biographer, and there are going to be books down in the bookstore that you can purchase afterwards, and Austen will be happy to sign them. And I have to say, so I'm a historian, Austen is a historian. His book on Pope Francis is fantastic. It's a model of wonderful historical writing that is fantastically accessible and informative. So I cannot commend his books to you more highly. Like I said, he's Pope Francis's biographer. He's a journalist. He lives with his wife, several dogs, a lot of sheep in the west of England, close to Wales. So please join me in welcoming Austen Ivereigh.
Thank you so much, Becky. Thank you for this invitation and the chance to be with you tonight. I speak a strange English, but I will try not to speak too fast because it's quite wearing, isn't it, listening to English spoken a different way. I'm staying with the Jesuits at the moment at Loyola Marymount, and one of the elderly Jesuits, I was telling him about a podcast which I really enjoy, and he said, "Oh, what, a postcard?" And I said, "No, podcast." He said, "Postcard?" I said, "No, a podcast." He said, "Oh, a podcast." So, it's lovely to be with you tonight to talk about something that I am passionate about, and I hope that you will be by the end of this talk, which is what is known as the Synod on Synodality, the global synodal process that the Church is currently embarked upon, which is the biggest and most important thing that has happened in the Church in my lifetime. I was born in '66, so I guess the Vatican Council was happening somewhere, but it didn't make a big impact on me as an infant. But this feels to me at the moment what we are going through in the Church as another moment like that, or maybe the implementation of that. I've been very involved in the Synod in ways that I'll tell you about in a minute. But I was thinking this morning, I don't know whether many of you have seen today's gospel. It's the famous gospel of Jesus going home. And he performs clearly amazing things. People can see his authority, his power, but rather than celebrate it, they deeply distrust it. And Mark's gospel says that Jesus was amazed at their lack of faith. And I was thinking about that this morning and thinking, what does faith mean in this context? I mean, clearly they believed in him, they saw what he was doing, but they weren't sure, they distrusted it. They didn't believe that it was of God. And in some ways at the moment, the Synod is a bit like that. I think it's clearly already showing that it is bringing about change. Things are moving in the Church. But I think a lot of people are standing back and saying, can we trust this? So I want to tell you tonight that I think you can. I think this process is of God. It is of the Spirit. And I say that because I've lived through various processes. I was part of the group in Italy in Frascati last September, and our job was to look at all the reports from all the bishops' conferences of the entire world, including, of course, the US one, and to try and understand what the Spirit was saying to the churches through that process. Now, just so you understand what's involved, every single bishops' conference in the world submitted a synthesis or a summary. There were 114 of these reports. You think how many dioceses there are in the world? Is it 2,000, 2,500? Extraordinary level of participation has gone on. So I was given reports to read from Haiti, from Malta, from Hungary, and I was really curious about how is it that we can possibly work out with all this diversity what the Spirit is saying to the church through all these different experiences. And I was a little bit skeptical. I was thinking, how does this work in practice? But I began to understand how it works, this thing they call the sensus fidelium, the instinct of faith of the ordinary people. Some of you may know that phrase is there in the Second Vatican Council document, Lumen Gentium. And I really came to see what it is. So when you read these reports, and they are a summary of all the dioceses and all the parishes that have got together, you start to hear the voice of the people of God and the Spirit speaking through them. And when you start to hear the same thing in all these different reports, you start to go, maybe there's something happening here, you know? So I began to understand what it is, what this thing is called the sensus fidelium. And just for you to understand, I mean, the reason I've become so convinced that this is of God is that I've come to understand that this is how the church develops. It's always how the church has developed. Right at the beginning of the church's story in Acts of the Apostles, you remember in Acts chapter 15, so Jesus has left. Jesus told his followers that he would leave his Spirit, that the Spirit would guide the church into the truth. And then Jesus has his ascension. The followers, the disciples assemble, and then there's this crisis, the whole question of Gentile people, non-Jewish people, becoming Christian. Should they be obliged to follow the Jewish law or customs? And there's a big debate in the church. There's a lot of division. And Jesus isn't around to tell them what to do. So what do? How is it that they are guided by the Spirit? It's a bit like right now. The church is, if you read these reports and you listen to most people, we're all aware that the church is in a very difficult time at the moment, a time of transition. The churches are much emptier than they were. The congregations are aging. The seminaries aren't full. We've had various crises of authority, the abuse crisis. What do? How do we move forward? And then, of course, we start to come together and we start to argue about it. And that's not helping, because all we do is we argue. The church has never been as divided as it is at the moment, I think, particularly in America, where even your bishops are completely divided. So what do we do about it? How do we move forward? And I don't think this is a new problem. I think this is the problem that's been there in the church from the very beginning. So let's go back to Acts chapter 15. What do the disciples do when they're faced with this problem that they can't agree about? It says very clearly in Acts chapter 15 that the whole body of the church was brought together. Everybody. I don't know how many there were. I mean, we've just heard in chapter 13 or whatever that 5,000 people became Christian that day. Obviously, there are a lot of people in the early church. Not like now, but there are still a lot of people. But nonetheless, they were all brought together. And everybody spoke. And everybody was listened to. And they listened especially to the youngest in the assembly. And what did they do? Did they all sit around and go, well, I think we should do this. I think we should do that. No, I think we should do that. No, they didn't. They spoke about their experience. They spoke about, in Acts it says, what they had seen and what they had heard. And as they spoke about their experience, it started to become clear what the Spirit was doing in the lives of ordinary believers. And we hear the stories of what the Spirit's doing in the lives of the Gentiles, the people who have become Christian and so on. And there's this kind of consensus emerges about what to do. There's a sense that this is what the Spirit is prompting the church to do. And then at the end, famously, Peter sends this letter, doesn't he, and says, it has seemed to the Holy Spirit and to us. A great phrase. It has seemed to the Holy Spirit and to us. So what is this thing we call a synod or synodality? Essentially, it's an assembly of the people to listen very, very carefully to each other, to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. And then where there is consensus, where there is clarity, then a decision to move forward in a particular direction. So here's the thing. When Pope Francis calls this synod on synodality and people start to get together, a strange thing happens. Now, in many cases, not a lot happens. The bishop says, I don't want to do this. The parish priest says, or I think in this parish you might have done an online questionnaire. People did lots of different things. But where people did come together and they spent time listening deeply to each other, something quite remarkable happened. People said, wow, this is what the church is and should do. This is how the church should be. So the story of synodality is very simple. In the early church, the first centuries of the church, synodality was the normal way of proceeding of the church. That is to say, when there were big decisions to be taken, there were directions to be sought, there were these gatherings. They were called councils. It's the same thing, a council or a synod. They involved bishops, yes, but they involved lots of other people as well. There were something like 800 synods between the 2nd and the 8th centuries. Incredible period of synodality. Also the time when the church was at its most missionary and its most open to new cultures, and when Christianity spread like wildfire. And then the story gets a bit more complicated, because in the Middle Ages, the church starts to take on a lot of the trappings of the state, of power, of juridical power. And we start to get this concentration of decision-making in the clergy and the bishops and so on. And then we get more and more of this centralization until, of course, the Second Vatican Council says, hang on, the church is not just the bishops and the clergy and the Pope. It is what? The people of God. The famous expression used in Lumen Gentium, the church is firstly the people of God. It is all the baptized. We need authority. We need different functions within the church. But basically the church is us. It is the whole body. And here's the thing that Pope Francis says. If we believe, and we do believe this, and if you don't believe it, then we'll have to talk about it. But what we believe is that at baptism, the Holy Spirit is poured out on us. Now, we might not be in a position in our lives often to hear that voice, to receive it, but the Spirit has been poured out on us. All believers, we all have that relationship. So here's what the Pope Francis says. If the Spirit is being poured out on all of us, then we have to get together to listen to each other to find out what the Spirit is saying to the whole body. Is that okay? We could almost stop now, and I would be happy that you know what synodality is. Because that's it. It's kind of not complicated. And yet, people have found all kinds of ways of resisting it. So, synodality involves an assembly. There has to be a meeting. It can be online if it really has to be, a Zoom, a synodal Zoom. Much better is to bring people together. And you have structured listening processes. Now, what I mean by that is there's certain things have to take place to say this is a synodal meeting, because it's not a parliament, it's not a discussion, it's not a business meeting. It's much more like prayer than it is like discussion. Here's how I was taught in Rome how to do it at the beginning of the synod. You have a group of maybe 8 or 10 people. It can be as low as 6, but I think you need, if you can, get it a bit bigger. You appoint a moderator, and the moderator is responsible for timekeeping and for reporting back to the main group. So let's say in this group, we divided ourselves into different groups, a moderator in each group, and you'd probably need to take something like an hour and a half over it, something like that. And you begin with a very simple question. And obviously the question will vary according to what you're trying to do. But really the question is, what are we being asked to do? What are we being called on to do? What is it the Holy Spirit is asking of us? That's the basic question. But it might be in the form of, what brings me hope? What makes me anxious? Something like that, whatever the issue is. So we're in a circle, and then each person speaks. First of all, you begin in silence, 5 minutes while you all think about the answers to that question. And then one person speaks. And when they speak for a maximum of whatever it is, 2 or 3 minutes. We don't want long lectures. We want you to say what's in your heart and what's in your experience. When that person is speaking, everybody else is silent. There's no response. And what you're doing is you're listening, and as you're listening, you're thinking about your own response to that in your heart. So each person speaks, and everybody just listens. And then you have another period of silence where you think about everything that has been said and what has resonated with you. And then you have a second round where you say what's in your heart. And there are really only 2 rules in this. As Pope Francis said at the beginning of the 2014 Synod on the Family, the 2 rules are this: speak freely and listen humbly. Speak freely because the Spirit can only operate in complete freedom. You have to be able to say whatever you want, whatever's the reality as you see it. And everybody else, you listen humbly. And then at the end of the session, you might have a bit of a freer discussion. But the moderator then tries to bring together the consensus, just as happened in Acts chapter 15. Well, what's emerging from this? And then you might come back into the big group, and each group says what's happened in their group, and maybe you start to see something important emerging. That's synodality. So this synod on synodality is inviting us, the whole church, to do this as a way of being in the church. When we have big decisions to make, or even small decisions to make in our parishes, rather than a few people going off into a room with the parish priest and coming up with a strategy, which is fine, but much better is to start with these meetings. You know, if it's the mission of the parish, what's going on in people's lives, what's important, what are people, it's the way to operate. I'll tell you a story. In my parish in England, I gave a workshop on synodality. I taught this method, which I've just described to you, and we did it, and everybody really, really appreciated it, and they said, wow, this is amazing. 2 weeks later, Putin invaded Ukraine. And my parish priest, who's the abbot of the local monastery, was very upset because he knows Ukraine very well. And he said, what can we do? Should we be opening our doors to Ukrainian refugees? And I said, well, let's just do the thing that we've just learned how to do. Let's have a synodal meeting. So word got round about this, that we were going to have a meeting about Ukraine and so on. And other churches heard about it, and they came too. So on the day, we had about 60 people, most of whom didn't know anything about this method. So I taught the method, and I said, we're here not to decide whether to receive Ukrainian refugees. We're here to ask what the Spirit is asking of us, how to respond to this situation. You have to open your heart and your mind. This is really, really important. If you set the agenda in advance, then it's not really a synodal meeting. But it has to have a purpose. But anyway, so we had the meeting, and in every single group, they said the same thing. It was amazing. They said, yes, we should be opening our homes to Ukrainian refugees. But the most important thing is that we have to be able to come together as a body, because the real question is not materially are we able to do this, but do we have the capacity to work together enough to enable it? See, the key thing here is, are we a body? Are we a community? When the Spirit calls on us, when Jesus calls us on mission to be missionary disciples, are we capable as a parish of doing it? Are we capable of acting together? Do we have enough communion? Is there enough participation? Do we feel a part of this body? That seems to me the really central question of the church of our time. In the synodal reports from each country, people said time and time again, we don't feel that we belong, that the decisions taken are too remote from us. There's a real desire on the part of people to be part of the life of the mission of the church. And this is what calls for greater co-responsibility, participation, taking decisions together. This is what the Synod on Synodality is all about. So I want to urge you or suggest to you or propose to you that maybe you might want to think about doing some of this in this parish. I'm only here tonight. I'm a blow-in. I'm off tomorrow. I was thinking beforehand, what is it I want to say to you? I basically want to say that to you. I really do. I think this is the greatest and most important thing that we as a church can do, because we can't solve these problems by discussion. You know, we're divided, we're fragmented, aren't we? The big question that comes out, the big thing that comes out of all these synodal reports is this kind of belonging. Do we belong to each other? Are we really a body? Or are we actually convinced of our own truth and we have nothing to learn? So to enter into synodality, to enter into synodal processes, you need humility. Pope Francis says in the book we did together, Let Us Dream, it's not that we possess the truth, but rather the truth comes to possess us when we together seek it. And in these synodal processes, what I've discovered is that that's what happens. So if you go into it saying, well, I know the answers in advance, what the church needs to do is this, then you can't really be part of a synodal process. We need humility. If we had all the answers, then we wouldn't need to do this. And the other great fruit of synodality is this that I've learned, is what Pope Francis talks about as being holding in tension our differences. So when you sit down with somebody who you know you really disagree with, who comes at all these questions from a totally different place from you. So, you know, if you're a more of a kind of progressive type of person, it's the traditionalist. The traditionalist thinks you're a progressive. You know what it's like. Catholics are divided into tribes, just like the whole of our society seems to be divided into tribes. Maybe what needs to happen is that we need to do these kind of listenings and hold together our disagreements, not try to resolve them. It's not about who's right and who's wrong, but about people being able to be honest about how they feel, how they see things, their experience, and you say what is important to you and what matters to you, and that's fine. We leave it like that, and we just allow, we're part of the same body. You think that, I think that. But in a synodal process, what you can do is hold these things together. And if you like, wait on what Francis calls the overflow. And it's happened time and time again in the church's history, that the church has come, there's this huge divisions over things. And everybody argues it out, and there's no resolution. But you kind of hold it together, and then by staying faithful to each other, by being prayerful, somehow a new horizon opens up. That's what Francis calls the overflow. The Spirit comes in. And suddenly you start to see, well, actually, maybe there's a way of being which is beyond position A and position B. It's beyond both, but it has the best of both in it. It happened time and time again in the church. See, what I love about this is that we either take seriously the idea that, as Jesus says, the Spirit guides the church, or we don't. And if the Spirit does guide the church, which is what Jesus promised us, what is the mechanism by which that can be made known? Is it just Father Albert upstairs in prayer waiting for illumination? Well, I hope that does happen, and I'm sure it does happen. But actually, you look at the church's history, it's much more likely to happen when everybody is involved and everybody has a chance to speak. And Father Patrick listens very carefully to all of you, sees where the consensus is, and then goes off, because he takes the decisions. But he takes the decision only after very carefully and deeply listening to everybody. And that's the best kind of decision, because you know that he's taken a decision after listening very deeply and carefully to you, which means even if you don't like the decision, you're far more likely to go along with it because you've been included in the process. I've learned that in synodality we talk about decision-making and decision-taking. In the church, the people entrusted with authority take the decisions. In the parish, it's the parish priest. In the diocese, it's the bishop. In the universal church, finally, it's the pope. They take the decisions. But that we are all called to be involved in the making of the decisions. Do you see the difference? Process of decision-making we all need to be involved in, or as many of us as possible. And then when the decisions are taken, they're taken after careful listening. But what makes this different, you might say, this sounds like democracy. Well, it isn't. Although, obviously, democracy comes out of those traditions in the Christian West, which are essentially synodal. But that's another story. But what is the difference between a synod and a parliament? In a parliament, what happens is the disagreement, or a congress, sorry, I should say, or any kind of parliament or lawmaking body, you have big disagreements, you have campaigns, you have both sides convinced that they're right, and they argue it out, and then finally it's resolved with a vote. And the side that wins the vote feels victorious, and the side that loses is a bit hurt and angry. The difference is never resolved, and it's never transcended. This has been the experience of other churches which have used kinds of parliamentary style of governance. For example, the Church of England. Anglican bishops say to me, don't do what we do, because the divisions only deepen. See, Parliament's a way of deciding on things as a way of avoiding violence. That's why parliaments come into being, because it's better to have a vote to resolve things than shooting each other. Somebody needs to tell Trump that, but anyway. But that's not the way the church operates. The church operates that actually our differences need to be held together and transcended. We need to be able to resolve our differences over time. That's what keeps us together. The gift of the Spirit is unity, but it's also a diversity. You can see the action of the Spirit, says Pope Francis, because the unity is a reconciled diversity. It isn't uniformity. It isn't everybody thinking the same. It's being able to think differently, but be able to be brought together and held together. That's the gift of the Spirit. So that's the difference. And the other difference between a synod and a parliamentary process is that in a synod, the final decisions are made. There's a final stage of discernment, which is by the bishops and ultimately the Pope. Sometimes in synods, bishops vote in favor of things, and the Pope says no, because it's his job as Pope or the bishop in a diocese to look at what's happening and to say that is of the Spirit or that is not of the Spirit. For example, in the Synod on Amazonia in October 2019, bishops from the Amazon region voted 2/3 in favor of allowing married men, married deacons, to be ordained priests. And Pope Francis said no to that, because he had seen how in the course of the debate and the discussion, the polarization had deepened. And he recognized that where the Spirit is at work, that doesn't happen. It's the opposite happens. People begin to come together. You never get unanimity, by the way, but consensus, a kind of coming together. That's one of the signs of the Spirit. But ultimately, you need somebody to be able to make sure, to decide whether that's happened or not. And in the Catholic tradition, that's the bishop or the Pope. But the important thing at the level of the parish and the diocese is that we have to begin to learn how to do this in the way we operate. And the end of the story, by the way, about the parish meeting on the Ukrainians is that now in our parish we're hosting 4 Ukrainian families. And, people from other churches are also involved in hosting, and it's brought us together in an amazing way. We've worked together to do this, all as a result of this meeting. So there are huge implications for how the church will develop in the future once we embrace this. And we're just at the beginning of this journey. So what's happened is that from October 21 through to summer last year was the first diocesan or local phase of the synod. And then each bishops' conference submitted a report, and then a group got together in Frascati. I was part of that group, and we drew up something called the Document for the Continental Stage. And that is an attempt to capture in about 40 pages what we've felt the Spirit was saying to the whole church. So there are certain themes which emerge from it, which are consistent over all these reports. One of them is the role of women. It's very striking how every single report talks about how the gifts and the ministry of women, the charism of women, is not recognized in the church as it should be. A few heads nodding here, I see. Huh? Yeah. Now, some of them do talk about ordination and the female diaconate. Definitely has come up quite a lot. But mostly, it was broader than that. It was, we need to find ways as a church of recognizing that the gifts are being poured out on women, but they are not yet being recognized in the church. Another question that came up a lot was how the church is able to make people feel welcome who feel often very marginalized by the church, famously LGBT people. But also lots of other people were mentioned, disabled people, people in different categories. And the other thing that came across really, really strongly was the polarizations, the disagreements within the church. Came up in almost every report that the church has become more fractious, that we all disagree so much. So the Document for the Continental Stage has as its title, Enlarge the Space of Your Tent, which comes from Isaiah chapter 54. And that seemed to us a really powerful image of what it is that the Spirit is saying to the church at this time. That the church needs to be more capacious, more able to contain differences, more able to embrace diversity, able to be welcoming to people on the outside. Now, we've published this report came out last year, and immediately people said, oh, you want to liberalize doctrine. This is going down the route of Protestantism and so on. Meanwhile, on the other side said that, well, we're very disappointed because you're not demanding that tomorrow we have, women priests. So both sides immediately attacked it. But actually, the reason that they're attacking it is that the document doesn't give clear answers. Why doesn't it give clear answers? Because at the moment there aren't any. And this is a really, really important point. We have to be able to learn to listen and then to sit with the uncertainty. That's not very easy in our society. In our society, everybody wants answers and they want action straight away. But actually, sometimes the way the Spirit works is that we just need to sit and listen and wait and allow the answers to emerge over time. And that's what's happening now. So across the world now, next month, there are going to be regional assemblies. They're called ecclesial assemblies because they involve bishops, religious, clergy, and lay people all together. So in Europe, for example, we have a big meeting in Prague. Every bishops' conference in Europe sends 4 delegates. In America, in the United States and Canada, it's one region. You're doing it differently here. which ends up with a group in Florida writing something. I haven't quite understood it. Latin America, I know there are 4 different regional meetings, and then Middle East, Africa, and Oceania. 7 regional meetings are going to be considering the responses to the document for the continental stage. So each local church reflects on this document and says what's on their mind. And then what happens is each assembly produces a document. Those 7 documents will be in turn synthesized, and that will form the basis of the Synod of Bishops, which begins in October this year. And then there'll be a second meeting of the Synod of Bishops the following year, October 2024. So in total, we're talking about a 3-year process, October 21 to October 2024, the biggest consultation of the people of God in human history, and possibly the biggest consultation ever. People say, oh, well, hardly anybody has taken part. It's involved very few numbers of Catholics. Here in the United States, the figure has been given of 700,000. In France, they say 200,000. Spain, 150,000. Tell me, is that a lot or isn't it? As a proportion or a percentage of mass-going Catholics, it's a lot less than 10%, okay? But mostly when you ask people to turn out for things in a parish, what kind of percentages do you normally get? I think it's a huge participation, particularly given it was in the context of COVID, and there were many bishops and people just, frankly, not really behind it. I think we're just at the beginning of this process. I think it's been remarkable. But what really matters more than the numbers is the experience of those taking part. Because what's really moved me is that when people have had the kind of experience that I described earlier, when it's genuine listening in a group, they've experienced a change within themselves, that they now feel, so many people have said, you know, for the first time I feel I've been listened to and that what I have to say matters. And people say things like, you know, I mean, an LGBT person told me in London that she said, I knew God loved me, but I didn't think the church did. But now, when I told my story and people listened, I now realize I really do belong to the church. I feel like I'm part of the church and that the church's mission is mine. She's become a missionary disciple because she's had that encounter with God's mercy through the synod. Just simply being listened to and feeling that communion, that mercy. And that is repeated across many, many of the reports where they say people had this experience of belonging. So, going back to where I was at the beginning, we live in a time of fragmentation in our society. In our church, things are breaking up. It's harder to belong to each other. It's hard, we're divided, more and more divided. And you say, God never leaves us alone in a crisis. God is always there offering us the grace of conversion in any tribulation or crisis. That's something I've learned from Pope Francis. How is God walking with the church right now in this situation? How is the Spirit, grace, enabling the church to move on from this? Well, I think after the first year of this synod, I think I can say with some confidence that the gift is the synod, synodality. It's nothing new. It goes right back to the origins of the church. It's part of the church's DNA. In other words, we recover the gift that the church already has, which turns out to be a gift of the Spirit for what the church needs at this time. So that's really all I wanted to say to you tonight, is that unlike those skeptical people in Nazareth, I think we should trust that this is of God. I think we should say, yes, the Spirit is doing something here. I have no idea how it will turn out. I have no idea what the result is. But I'm pretty confident that the fruit of all of this will be that we as a church learn to practice this deep listening and discernment in a prayerful way as part of our decision-making and as part of our internal culture, I think this will become more and more the way the church operates. And in doing so, the church will recover something essential about how it is and what it is, which belongs to it from the very beginning. You know, they say in the church there's nothing ultimately ever new. What we do is we go back to recover the things that we've lost, which then become a gift for our time. So that's my message to you. I hope it's helpful to you. And if I can in any way illuminate or illustrate any of this or clarify anything, then I'll be absolutely delighted to talk about that. If you want to ask me about Pope Francis, about writing the book together, or anything about the pontificate, in fact, you can ask me absolutely anything. And if you want to give me a hard time, that's also fine. Speak freely and listen humbly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Austen, for the words you shared with us and helping us all to understand better the process of synodality. And it's not like something already passed and been done, but like you said, that's a way, a roadmap for parishes to start to begin to implement that as a parish as we continue to kind of fulfill our mission. So now we're going to open the floor for some questions. There'll be a mic in the floor. We ask you to come to the mic to speak so everybody can hear you. And please, because of time constraint, just get to the question. We don't need like a 10-minute introduction. So everybody will get a chance to speak. Also to remind you, the bookstore is open. If you liked what Austen said and now you want to buy his books, you can do that. And he'll be glad to give you his autograph afterwards and sign your books. So start, getting ready for your questions as we get the microphone set up. And let me get the microphone to Don. And while, we're waiting, I have a question, Austen. One thing Pope Francis talks a lot about is becoming a missionary church. Can you share with us what does he mean by that term?
So Francis's diagnosis of the state of the church was made pretty clear in the speech he gave to the cardinals prior to his election in March 2013, almost 10 years ago. Where he presented the picture of the church as turned in on itself, as having withdrawn into itself, and had become actually remote from the people. It's not like the people had left the church, but it's almost like the church had left the people. And that the church had become obsessed with itself, with its own image, with its own reputation, with maintaining itself. But actually, it had lost its focus on the centrality of Christ. And he talked about the need for the church to rediscover the joy of evangelizing. And he meant by that a church that goes out of itself, goes out and makes contact with the periphery, the margins, the peripheries of need and want and poverty and suffering, but also the existential peripheries of ignorance, of loneliness, of depression. So an evangelizing church, a missionary church, is one that carries out the mission of Jesus Christ. And it begins by this same listening. In other words, it's about a church that knows how to listen to what's going on around it and to hear the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, and to then be able to work out how to respond to it. So a missionary church is one that goes out, but it's also one in which everybody feels that they are part of the mission of the church, that we are all missionary disciples. We all have the mission of Christ in different ways. The question then becomes, how am I being called to carry out that mission in my life, in my parish, in my way? And then that has implications for maybe how people can discover that for themselves. But that's what I think Pope Francis means.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question, please.
Good evening, Father. Thank you, Austen, for coming. We came up from Long Beach with my daughter from St. Joseph. My question for you, Austen, is what is the relationship between synodality and dealing with the crises that the church is facing, like obviously the abuse crisis that we've had, the loss of adherents? Are those two separate buckets, or will synodality help deal with these issues?
The loss of?
Adherents,
Adherents,
believers.
yeah, I see what you mean, yeah. So specifically a synod is called to deliberate on a particular question. So a synod of bishops, the synod that's going on at the moment, is concerned with the whole question of how the church's internal culture works, governance and so on. So to your first question, the implications of this for the abuse crisis. Actually, the abuse crisis, I talk about this a lot in the second book, Wounded Shepherd. The way Francis guided the church through the abuse crisis, particularly in 2018, was to ask himself, okay, what is this crisis telling us about, first of all, the truth we need to face, and then secondly, where the Spirit is inviting us to change and convert. And you can see throughout that year, 2018, Francis is saying, this isn't just about new laws, new structures, which of course are necessary, and he's done, by the way, a lot of that. But more deeply, it's a crisis of what one might call clericalism. That's to say, it's the problem of the lack of participation of the people of God in the life of the church. In other words, power has become concentrated, decision-making has been concentrated too much in the institutional, juridical element. And so you can see him coming to this understanding that this is partly, I think, why this synod on synodality has been called in the way it has been called, in which we are not just consulted as ordinary faithful, but we are the subjects, if you like, of the process. Because this is all about learning that we can only ever move on from the abuse crisis when we realize what Vatican II called us to be, which is a church of the people of God in which we all take part in the mission and the life of the church. And in a way, that answers, by the way, the second part of that question, which is the question of adherence. Because as people start to believe that the church is theirs and they are part of it, they take part more, life comes back into the church because the church recovers its mission.
Yeah, thank you, Austen. In your book, Let Us Dream, you speak about existential dystopia. You go on to enlarge on that idea by saying we have a virus of indifference. Would you explain what you treated briefly in your book?
Sure.
Could you speak to that?
Sure.
Thank you.
Just to be clear, Let Us Dream is Pope Francis's book. I helped him with it, but it's all him. Nothing in it is from me. I don't have any ideas of my own, which is true, by the way, I don't. I genuinely don't. What Francis means when he talks about the virus of indifference is he says that the greatest enemy, so the Spirit is calling us out, as I've just described, to pay attention, to listen carefully to the margins and so on. Where is the suffering speaking to us? And then what stops us doing that? You know, he's a great spiritual director. He first of all says the Spirit is calling us to do this, and then he shows us the temptation or the obstacle which prevents us from receiving that grace. He's a great spiritual director. And in this case, what he's saying is we have to combat the virus of indifference. It's the great story of the Good Samaritan. Why is it that the two religious people, the priest and the Levite, pass by on the other side? What makes them indifferent to that man who is bleeding at the side of the road? And there are all sorts of reasons why they're indifferent. They're afraid of being displaced. They're trying to cling on to something that they've got. They're afraid about impurity, and there are all sorts of reasons. The virus of indifference, it's what keeps us focused on ourselves, makes us preoccupied with our well-being, with our security, with our power, and we become focused on ourselves, and we frankly stop caring. And once that happens, we turn in on ourselves, and then it becomes impossible to grow as people. It becomes impossible to grow spiritually. That's what he means, Monsignor, by that, the virus of indifference, which is a big problem in wealthy societies particularly. Poor people have that much less.
Oh, haven't spoken in a microphone in a long time. I tend to break things down into very simple components. I am returning Christian, surprisingly a returning Catholic. I wasn't expecting that, honestly, because
Welcome back.
I went to Catholic school. I did all that stuff all the way up to college, but when I went.
Yeah.
But Pope Francis was the beginning of my. I actually had a holy card of St. Francis when I was little that was embroidered. We used to trade holy cards in church. I don't know if anybody did that, because we had to go every morning. Okay, so the way I see it, all this trouble, the people, not marginalized, and of course, all the abuse, and just, if you want to go back even farther, the ones that were married, that had illegitimate kids, I mean, there's so much disgusting corruption in the world that when you think about Christianity, you don't want to see it in the church, right? So how can that not mess with your brain, or mess with your heart, and mess with your relationship with Jesus? And how can that not mess you up? So to me, that is, and the word corruption is so perfect. Because what is corruption really? It's the breaking down, it's the decay, right?
The breaking down of what?
It's decay.
Decay, okay.
If something is corrupted, you can't put it back together. So what to me, and I'm asking, it is a question, because I want to know if you get this and if you agree with me. But I see I keep wanting to say St. Francis, but I mean Pope Francis. He'll probably get sainted.
Hopefully that'll follow later.
Oh, I'm sure he will. They're going to find 2 miracles, What he brought in right away, the bus, like not wearing everything that he did right away, that even if you had half a ear to the news, you knew it, was, okay, let's go all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah.
So he said, forget about putting the pieces back together. Yeah. We can't, it's corrupted. Yeah. Let's just start fresh.
Okay. So is there a question coming?
That's my question. Do you agree with that?
Do I agree with your description?
That's it.
Yes, there's only one bit I didn't agree with, which is the idea that once you're corrupt, that's it, that's over. Because actually, I think corruption happens to all of us, but the mercy of God is infinite, One of the things, but I do agree with the rest of what you've said.
I just meant the church. I'm not corrupted. Look, I am
But the same is true of the church too. The church is all of us. We are the body. And, we can fall away. But, what Francis did from the very beginning, you're quite right, was to get rid of all that intermediary culture in the Vatican, and be accessible and direct. And the really interesting question is, if Francis is, as you described him, and I agree, people looked at him and said, that's Christ, that's how Christ would be. How do you explain the hatred against him? How do you explain the opposition?
The hatred against Jesus? He
exactly.
was on the cross. Come on, nobody was hated more than him.
So then the same question is, why, when the Pharisees see Jesus and they see the great things he performs, they know he's an extraordinary man of God, why do they hate him?
Status quo.
Well, I think
status quo. They just don't want to lose their stuff.
So they feared. There's something that they feared to lose. Okay.
Right.
And I think the same thing is happening a lot in the church. There's a lot of resistance to Francis because people are afraid to give up something
their
when they
stuff,
see him.
Right? Their stuff.
Yeah. So I think that's the dynamic that's been produced. But in a way, it's a good sign. All this turbulence is a good sign.
It's a great sign.
Where the good spirit is acting, the bad spirit tries to, As Pope Francis says, if the dogs are barking, Sancho, it's a sign we're advancing. It's a line from Don Quixote, apparently. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights about this process. The dominant themes that you mentioned include really respecting and understanding the voice of women in the church, and especially the alienation of LGBTQ community. And I wonder if you could elaborate not just on those dominant themes, but what are you discerning from the voices of women and the LGBTQ community?
Yeah. Well, so, I don't want to try to say too much that isn't in the document, because the document's actually very rich. You can download it, by the way, from the Synod website in Rome, synod.va. Just look for document for the continental stage. I mean, there are about 8 paragraphs on women, really rich, beautiful paragraphs. But I mean, I think the point is this, that people say we need, as a church, to discern, to look at why it is that people feel excluded, and why we are not embracing the gifts that the Spirit is pouring out, in the case of women particularly. Yeah. And I think it doesn't go into detail, which some people find frustrating, about why that might be the case. But what we've done in the document is simply try to capture what was being said in all of these reports. And what's striking is that they were consistent. There's a line actually in the report from England and Wales, which Cardinal McElroy quotes in a fantastic article he has written in response to the document for the continental stage, which you can read at America magazine. And the quote that he quotes from the England and Wales document is that we need to become, as a church, more like Jesus in the sense of being able better to hold together truth and mercy. Because what Jesus does is he proclaims boldly the truth, but does so in a way that embraces and includes everybody, that nobody is excluded from God's love and mercy. Now, there's too much. What happens is if you talk about mercy, people go, oh, you're being soft on the truth, you know. So this is what it's about. It's about being able to understand how it is that we can be a more merciful, loving, welcoming, inclusive church, better able to contain difference and diversity. And that doesn't contradict the bold proclamation of the gospel, which is ultimately about the encounter with a God who is love and mercy. They're not in contradiction, but so often we set them up as contradictions. I think it's things like that. That's what the document is saying.
And in follow-up, are there lessons for us as a community that you've experienced from your work within your own parish, for example, that will allow us to be able to better listen to those voices?
That's a great question. So I told you about the experience with the Ukrainians, and actually then the parish council in my parish started to say, okay, we need to get back all those groups that we had before COVID. Have you had the same discussion here in the parish? You know, you had COVID, everything stopped. Okay, how do we get back those groups that we had? And I said, thinking of Francis, I think, hang on, why don't we stop and ask the people? Let's first of all find out where the needs of the people are. What is it that people say they want? Do they want formation? Do they want participation in mission? Or do they want to go back to the old groups, whatever. So we are actually having a synodal process in our parish beginning the whole of Lent. We're going to have big listening sessions, inviting everybody in the parish to these listening sessions. And we're going to ask very specific questions about their own faith, about what they expect from the parish, asking them also to what their own hopes and dreams are for the parish. That's a great question, by the way. You know, what is your dream for Holy Family in South Pas? What do you dream this could be? A lot of what you dream might already be happening, but there might be something that comes out of that listening, which you go, wow, that's beautiful. And if everybody comes around that, then maybe the Spirit's trying to tell us something. So I think build it into your own parish mission discernment. Thank you.
Hi, I'm from a neighboring parish, so I apologize for being a few minutes late, and I apologize if this is a redundant question. I really appreciated the process of the synod when you were describing how it's done. And I'm wondering, is the process written out anywhere? And also, is it being taught at each Catholic church?
Yeah, so that's really, really good. I think one of the great needs now is we need facilitators. We need people who have a bit of training. It's not terribly complicated, but I think there's a whole ministry now emerging in the church. And actually, by the way, I think it's a ministry that women are particularly good at.
Is it written out somewhere, or
well,
is there a YouTube
the process that I've described is quite well documented. I mean, on the Synod website, you'll find stuff about it.
Thank you.
And you can go to the Archdiocese Synod website, and you have that process described and how you train facilitators and all of those things.
Yeah. But I do want to make this point. I do think there's the need for formation and training. I think there needs to be a big investment in that. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for hosting. I'm a big fan of the work that you've done. I would like to ask a question, given your exposure to Pope Francis and your work in the Vatican. Can you speak about the opposition that you see? Because I think it's kind of not really conveyed well. Some people say it's just really an Anglophone phenomenon, but I would like to ask you that question.
Yeah. Well, we've just had a very turbulent January in Rome because Pope Emeritus Benedict died on January the 31st, and then Cardinal Pell died on January the 10th. And we've had two books come out which attack Francis. We've had Cardinal Pell's own attacks and so on. And I've done a bit of an analysis, if you're interested, on Commonweal magazine. There's a big article by me. It was my pre-Lent penance to have to read these books and try to work out what... But what I was very struck by was how they all attack Francis for his governance of the church, and the synod in particular. And that's why I think, as Cardinal Hollerich, who's the chair of the synod, said recently, when you see this level of attacks and opposition, clearly God is doing something important here. Otherwise, the bad spirit wouldn't bother. And I really am convinced of that. You're asking about whether the opposition is principally an Anglophone thing. A very large part of the most vigorous resistance to Francis has its headquarters here in the United States. Why? Because there is a sector of the church here which is frankly deeply worldly, which is, has made an idol of the free market, rich, powerful people, and who pay angry people to write things on websites. And I think that gives the impression of a great number of people here who are against Francis. I don't think numerically it's very big, but they are rich, they are powerful, they make a lot of noise. But I think Francis looks at it and he goes,
Thanks, Austen. So, it's a sign of the Radical Reformer. I remember where I was when I read it. Like, you know, it's one of those books that, like, it just was so good. I read it early on to try to understand what, and it was just super helpful. So to get to meet you was really fun.
Thank you.
I kind of have two hats. The parish council hat, I feel like you have really been helpful and spoke to. I also have this focolare hat where I work, and so this idea of the question is more to that hat, like this need for a spirituality to sustain this. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about a spirituality that can sustain this, because the culture enculturates us to polarization, to immediately see things in a polarity. So, thanks.
Well, I think rather than say that there is a particular spirituality, I think there must be spirituality built into the synod process. When you're having a synod meeting, begin in silence, begin with a prayer, begin with a bit of scripture if that's appropriate, maybe light a candle, so people immediately feel that this is not, you know, a business meeting. I think that's important. And then silence. Silence. It's very simple. It doesn't cost anything. Build in silence into the process so that when somebody's spoken, you know, you don't immediately go to the next person. Just take a moment to listen. Well, you do this in Focolare very well, don't you? I mean, this is part of the way Focolare is. Yeah. Would you like to hear my Focolare joke? How many Focolare people does it take to change a light bulb? Many, yet one.
Hi, I just have a question. This whole process is fascinating to me and very welcome. But because of the vocal hierarchy that is fighting this process, how do I have trust in what I say in a synod or my fellow parishioners say will truly be listened to and not just, well, we put you through a process, but your bishop says this.
Right.
Your cardinal says this, and you must follow this.
I understand. Can I ask you a question? Did you
Yes.
take part in a synodal meeting as part of the diocesan process?
Small parts of it, yes.
Okay. Did you read the document that the US bishops did?
Yeah, I read that on my own.
Did you feel that document, did you recognize in that document what you had heard and what had been expressed?
Some of it.
Yeah.
But it's very inconsistent
Right.
with the hierarchy and being about your age. I do remember, I remember a church that was very hierarchical,
Yes.
punishing black and white. I think we've evolved greatly from that, but there's still rhetoric that comes out that we hear of, that's very nice what you think, but you're wrong.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, but-
nice what you think, but you're
Yeah.
wrong.
No, I get
So
that.
why talk?
Yeah, I get that there are bishops like that, and I get that the church is often like that. But I asked you about your experience of the synod because...
Truth be told, I don't know yet, because I don't know what the result of it's going to be.
Ultimately, the question is, do you feel, not that everything you've said, because a synthesis, and I have learned this in the synod, by the way, a synthesis isn't a summary. We're not trying to summarize everything everybody said. That would be impossible. We're trying to say, okay, in all these voices and all these experiences, what's coming through? What are we, what are the constant notes? Which might be, by the way, a minority prophetic voice. It doesn't have to be the majority voice. And as I say, when I went to Frascati last year, I really went there thinking, how the heck do you do this with all these different reports? And I have written about the process, by the way, for America Magazine, if you're interested. And I won't describe it here because it would take too long. But what I was really impressed by, I came to see that we really are capable of doing this. And I really do feel, after those 2 weeks, everybody was listened to. We even had one exercise where we were asked to have an empty chair in the group. And the question was, which voices in the reports that you've read have not yet so far been mentioned in these groups? And we had a whole great list of, and we made sure they were in there. The efforts that I think that's been made to listen has been very moving to me. And ultimately, the test will be the documents that come out of it. Do you say, yeah, that sounds like what I've heard and what I've said? And that's why I asked you.
It depends how much is edited.
Yeah.
And by whom, but.
But I mean, that's why I'm saying, go away, read the document for the continental stage and see what you think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
A few years ago, I can't remember how many, pre-COVID, it was pointed out to me by a fairly authoritative source that the concept of sensus fidelium is not always taught in seminaries in this country.
Yeah,
that it has been removed from the curriculum, or if it is in the curriculum, it's quickly passed over. How do we exist, and what do we do in that kind of an environment?
Yeah, look, there's a lot needs to change and develop in the church, Seminary formation. We could easily have a whole half-hour meeting about what needs to change in the church. The question is this: sensus fidelium is there in Vatican II, and now, 50 years after the Second Vatican Council, we have a pope who is giving concrete flesh to the idea of a church rooted in the sensus fidelium, whereby a process of discernment starts not with a meeting of bishops or theologians, but with the gathering of the people of God to say what the Spirit is saying to them through their experience. That is the sensus fidelium. It's happening. We're doing it.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you so much. I enjoyed your article in America Magazine. I have a very basic question, and I feel sad when I ask it, when I look around this room.
Go for it.
Why does the Pope stop short of allowing a discussion on women being priests? May I just add a comment to that? Sure. You've got the German synod and their surrounding cohort who are very open to that discussion. And for some reason, our beloved Pope Francis is trying to quell that. I don't know if he feels there's going to be too much of an uprising with the church, that people are going to protest too much. And then you've got Poland and their cohorts who are allowing women to participate in this way. They're allowing nuns to come in and quietly pray while they have their discussion. I don't want to hear, because Jesus was a man and because the 12 apostles were men. I really want to know, over half in here are women.
It's a great question. It's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the answer that Pope Francis has given about this is that John Paul II closed that door. When John Paul II made that famous statement that the discussion on the ordination of women, the Pope has no authority and so on. Pope Francis regards that as binding, you know? So that's one answer to the question. The other part of your question was a really interesting one about the German synod. The German synod is not a synod, all right? And it doesn't pretend to be. It's called der synodale Weg, the synodal path. That's the name it gave itself. But it's not a synod. It is something that's very sui generis in Germany, that was created as a result of a report by 3 universities into the abuse crisis. And the university said the church needs to change this, then 4 areas, right? And then they created a body which has representatives from different parts of the German church to come together to debate and to discuss those reforms. Why isn't it a synod? Because it doesn't start with the consultation of the people of God. It hasn't involved the parishes. And what Pope Francis has said about the synod is that in that sense, it's an elitist, which is true. By the way, there's a place for that. There's nothing wrong with that.
I give you that.
Yeah.
Why did Pope Francis stop short of opening, I'm not saying that women have to be priests,
Right.
the discussion, and let me ask you one more question.
Yes.
Somebody brought up, it was the very first question, about the scandal in the church with the priests and the bishops and et cetera.
The abuse crisis.
When this happened, I mean, how many, 50, whatever, were the priests excommunicated from the church who were guilty of this, or the bishops who also knew about this? But now you know about the cohort of women who wanted to be priests. In fact, they are priests.
Got it.
And you're familiar with the former priest who wrote a book about this. Women who are priests and bishops, but they were excommunicated from the church, even though a legitimate bishop ordained them to be priests. Now, I mean,
without going into that one, just very briefly, Pope Francis hasn't prohibited discussion of women priests. It's happening all over the church. It's in all the synod documents. There's free speech in the church. What he said was that he reminded the church about Pope Paul's decision that effectively said the Pope can't do that. But here's the important thing I want you to understand about that whole question. What Francis is doing in Rome is appointing women to very high positions of leadership, and the whole church is calling on ways in which women's leadership and ministry needs to be recognized. The question that needs discerning is, does that imply ordination? Do women first need to be ordained, or would that be to further clericalism? These are difficult, big questions, and they're up for discussion. They are part of the synodal process. All that will be discussed. It'll be discussed in October.
And the unfortunate thing is, it's an all-male discussion.
No, it's not. In these ecclesial assemblies, in the ecclesial assemblies that are about to take place, we have bishops, clergy, religious, most of whom are women, and lay people, most of whom are women.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Next question.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have 2 questions. One, what does Pope Francis say on how we can bring young adults, like myself, back into the church? And it's such a big issue. And I'm, a very small percentage that still goes to church. So that's my first question.
It's a great question. I'm not sure I can say exactly what he would say, but I know that he would probably say, is the task, how do we bring young people back into the church? Is the object of this to get bums on pews, if you excuse the phrase? Is this a recruitment exercise? Is this a marketing operation? Or is this about how do we enable young people to have the encounter with Christ? And how do we find out what the Spirit is saying through the experience of young people? I was telling this story just earlier that I was giving a lecture yesterday at LMU. And anyway, the discussion ended up about young people. And I said, well, why don't we ask some of them? So some of the young people said very interesting things, how they had been educated by the church, how they actually really loved the priests and the religious who had taught them, but they didn't go to Mass. They weren't interested in belonging to the institution. I'm religious, but I don't belong. Something very important is happening to your generation in relation to the institution. But I'm convinced it's something new is also being born, which we can only find out when we actually listen. And Pope Francis held a whole synod on young people in 2018. I don't know whether you followed it. And that began with a listening to young people and produced a document called Christus Vivit. And that whole document is all about how a church that must need to learn to listen to the young people rather than simply talk at them like I'm doing to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And the second question is, does Pope Francis elaborate on how we, the church, can assess what traditions should be kept and what could change? And if there are questions that should be discussed when folks are being trained in facilitating these ministry groups?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, synodal group meetings need a focus. They're not just about anything, you know, and therefore part of the facilitator's job, in a way, is to keep the focus on the topic. But if you ask me in general, should topics be excluded, I would say no. Why?
I think my question is, how should we assess, what traditions, should be kept, and,
well, okay, so this is
the new topics.
This is what we call discernment, What is it about the churches? We are part of a tradition. That tradition has been handed on from the very first apostles. It's a beautiful tradition handed down from generation to generation. And part of our task as a church is to preserve and hand on that tradition to others. But we also know that there are things that get caught up with that tradition on the way, like a river that collects garbage as it proceeds. And at some point you have to say, let's take that stuff out and go back to the stream where it was a bit purer. So a tradition is a living tradition. It's a dynamic tradition. It's like a tree that, it's still the same tree, but it grows and grows and grows. And sometimes you have to lop off the odd branches. But that's the task of discernment, and I think Francis has explained that really well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have a question, but I just want to tell you that I'm going to a Bible study this year that is studying the history of the church, and it is very interesting. And I think that one of the things that is very consistent for me is that God provides for us when we need help and when we need consistency in our church. And I think this is what you're doing, and I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want it to be very successful.
Thank you. It's got to be a really special question. No pressure.
I need to write down my question, otherwise it's going to be gobbledygook. So, first of all, we are the mystical body of Christ, and we have a Eucharistic-centered faith practice. That's the way I was raised in the Catholic Church. What does the Pope consider the best way to lead the Church and not allow socio-political movements to override the discernment process of what is incrementally is the next expression of the Church?
Yeah.
So basically, we're all bombarded every day by socio-political movements, and he's very much aware of that. Yeah. And it's not the important thing in the third world.
Right.
But it is happening in the first world that runs the world. So if you can answer that question.
So I think things like what in the first world?
So what I'm saying is the modern world,
Yeah.
you know, basically is pushing sociopolitical movements.
Socio-political movements,
that,
okay.
are pressuring the church.
Yeah. How do we resist those? Well, I mean, partly what preserving, why we need processes of discernment and why we need the authority of ultimately the Pope as the kind of final discerner. Because, and I've learned this again doing this process, you know, we begin to realize what's merely opinion and what reflects the culture, you know, and what is of the Spirit. And we have to learn to listen to these two things and work out what's, you know, and opinions are fine, but they're just that. They're opinions. They reflect the culture. Okay? That's not where the action is. The action is in this other thing which brings life, brings joy, brings peace, which we recognize as being of the Spirit. And we've got to get, as we go into these processes, we learn more and more how to recognize those two different voices. Part 2 of Let Us Dream, by the way, Pope Francis gives a beautiful few pages on how we can recognize the good spirit and how we can recognize the bad spirit in our own lives, in the church and in the world. I really recommend you reading them. It's been lovely to be with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Austen. And we wish you God's blessings as you continue your ministry in helping us understand more the mind of the Pope and, you know, keeping that communication between our shepherd, chief shepherd, and his flock. Also, I want to thank the Institute of Advanced Catholic Studies at USC for sponsoring Austen's trip to our parish and for all their, you know, preparation and planning. We're very grateful to all of you.
And I have one more thing, because your wonderful question, and thank you for bringing your daughter, and thank you for being here, Catherine. I forgot to ask if anybody from the Mom's Rosary group is here. You don't have to say, but I think that the presence of children and young people are so important in the church, and the moms and dads who pray for them, and for the folks, especially Dawn and Anne down in the bookstore, who helped put this on as well. So thank you again for coming.
And if you don't know where our bookstore is, you got to go down. There's an elevator or the stairs, and they'll open. And again, thank you for all of you who joined us from other parishes. God bless you all, and drive carefully.